What's going on, guys? Welcome in. Now that we're pretty much finished with the Treasure Cup and OP-01 is coming to a close, I know a lot of people are starting to set their sights on the OP-02 constructed meta, and I think before we get there, it's very important to note that from March 3rd through the 9th, there's going to be a pre-release tournament, as you can see on the screen here, which participation in this tournament gets you this pretty sick smoker card, and of course you are able to get a couple of cards in a pack of 75 total cards, which have commons and uncommons in them, and they're all going to be stamped with a pre-release stamp on them. I'm assuming very similar to how the super pre-release, how they did theirs. And of course, the winner of this tournament gets a pre-release stamped winner card of the smoker, which I think it's cool. I mean, these things are going to be a hot commodity among the collector market. I don't know how viable this card's going to be in the meta. I'm assuming it's just a collector item for the most part. But regardless, if you want to get this and you want to perform well, what does it look like to do well in one of these tournaments, right? We've never had a sealed tournament for One Piece, the card game, ever. And if you're from the Magic scene, you're probably a little bit familiar with how sealed works. And the One Piece card game sealed tournament works somewhat similarly to that as well. So the rules for the sealed tournament, if you're unfamiliar with how sealed goes, every participating player gets 6 packs, and they have to build a constructed deck with those 6 packs, a deck of 40 cards as opposed to 50. And of course you have your 10 Dawn, and you can choose any leader that you want to, whether it's from OP-01 or the OP-02 set. And also one other thing that's really important to note is that there's no color restriction for building your deck. So you don't have to stick to your leader's color. If you want to build a deck of all 5, or I guess it's 5 colors at this point, you can. And so what does that look like? How do you go about doing this? Like, if you've never done a sealed tournament before, how do you build a deck out of stuff like that? So first off, let's go through what leaders there are to choose from, because you can choose any leader out there. Let's go through and see how they stack up against each other, and then let's kind of talk about some strategy on how to build a deck in sealed format. So starting off, let's just go over the OP-02 leaders, and I'm going to say straight off the bat, a lot of these are probably not going to be very playable in this meta, simply because you'll find that a lot of these leaders are very niche. They have very specific archetypes, and they need those support cards, and they really dwell in the constructed format. So starting off with Edward Newgate, of course, you're going to be having an advantage off the bat with 6 life, 6,000 power. However, of course, his effect is at the end of your turn, take 1 card off the top of your life. So you're losing life every turn, which technically you're drawing cards, which is nice, especially in a sealed format. That's super important to be able to draw cards. However, I think because there's not a lot of counter power, and your events are totally up to if you draw them or not, or open them in your packs or not, this leader is probably not as viable as you would like to think. So I would say consider it, but probably don't play it. You go next to Garp. Once again, Garp is it's a niche. It needs a lot of support. I don't think this leader, so the leader's effect is when one of your characters is given, or when the leader's given a Dawn card, give one of your opponent's characters with cost 7 or less -1 cost for the turn. The whole minus cost ability for the sealed really depends on having more cards that feed into that synergy. So it's going to be hard to get them. You don't know what you're drawing ahead of time, obviously. So it's one of those where I just don't see this card doing spectacular. On top of that, before I go any further, it's really important to note that all of these cards that are 4 life, the ones that are dual colors, are at a super disadvantage for this format, because the whole point of having 2 colors in the 4 life is that you're having access to cards that you probably wouldn't have to access in 1 color, right? But in this format, since you have access to all colors, there's really no point in having the 1 life deducted. So I would recommend going with any leader that has 5 life or more. Any of these dual color ones are going to be at a disadvantage, especially ones that are more niche like Garp. Next up, we have Kinemon. Once again, a very niche card in the fact that you're going to have to have Land of Wano cards. There's a fair amount in this set, but you're depending a lot on opening them, and a lot of the core cards for Land of Wano are in OP-01. which you don't have access to. So I think this is a pass on this leader. Sanji actually is a leader I think you could play in this set. I think it's one of the few in OP-02 that you could play. However, going back to what I just said a few minutes ago is that the disadvantage here is you're at 4 life. And for what, right? You still have access to all of the cards in the game that you pull. So it's not like it's not like you're accessing 2 different colors. You're accessing all of them. So 4 life is a little bit risky. So I would recommend probably not building this, but if you do pull it, I would consider it. I would say this is a consider card. The effect itself is rewarding you for playing cards with no base effect, which you will probably get a lot of in your packs, as a lot of commons and uncommons have just basic vanilla stat lines. So this is it's a playable, it's worth considering, but probably not one that I would look to actually try to pilot. I don't know. I personally don't think any of the 4 lifers are worth it. I actually think Ivankov is one that you could probably run and do okay with. So one of the things in sealed formats is that you probably are going to run into having an empty hand. There's not a lot of card draw mechanics, and you're probably going to be looking to counter out quite often, especially if you don't have that many blockers. So you're probably going to be empty-handed towards the end of the late game, and having the leader effect be able to draw you 2 cards at the end of your turn, kind of rewarding you for dumping your hand, is something that could be good. So I actually think Ivankov is one that you could potentially end up running and doing okay with. Out of all of the leaders in OP-02, I think Ivankov is probably the best. Still not the most optimal out of all of the ones that you could choose from OP-01 and OP-02 though. Next up we have Magellan. Once again, very niche. It's an okay card. The effect, you're not going to be really returning your Dawn. There's not a lot of cards that return Dawn other than some purple cards, right? And that's very situational if you're able to get those cards. So the effect is probably not going to be happening very often. If you just want a vanilla 5 life, 5k leader, go for it. But Magellan's probably not going to be one that you would want to run and do well at if you do run it. So it's worth a consider, but it's like a light consider. I probably just would skip it altogether. Next up is Z. The effect is fine, -4 Dawn, and KO one of your opponent's characters with cost 3 or less, then this gains 1,000 power. However, when you're using that, it really is like in this specific format, not getting enough cards that minus abilities. Once again, you're not going to know what you get. You could get minus abilities, and if you do, then that's awesome. But if not, then this card's kind of just a dud. A lot of the 3-cost cards, you're not going to want to spend or toss away 4 of your own Dawn to get rid of it. So I wouldn't run this. Once again, 4 life, it's a skip for me. Next up, and this is actually, I think, the last one from this OP-02, is Smoker. And Smoker is a fine leader in OP-02, but once again, because it's a minus ability effect, it needs very specific cards for this to really pop off. And because of that, I don't see this leader doing spectacular. I think it's just an okay leader, but I wouldn't consider running it. So that wraps it up for OP-02, at least for the leaders here. Let's go over into OP-01, which is probably where you're going to be picking most of your leaders from anyway. So in OP-01, obviously Zoro is Zoro. It's a really good card in the sense of just put 1 Dawn underneath it and everything gets 1,000 power. I think it's a very strong effect also for this format. Now, typically you're going to want to have a wide board, a lot of weenies, and then pump them up and swing in. But you could actually just do this with general cards and I think still be okay. I think Zoro is probably, that and Kid are probably the top leaders for this format. And so I would consider running Zoro, absolutely. In fact, I might run Zoro myself, even though I told myself I wouldn't. I wanted to try something different besides Zoro, but you can't argue with this stat. It's just good. It's just a good evergreen stat. It doesn't matter what cards you're running. This stat applies to anything. So really, really strong. Next up, we have Law, which actually out of all of the 4 life leaders, I would consider Law a decent one to run. The effect of Law is actually one that you could probably end up pulling off. There's not a lot of removal in this set, so having a board of 5 is very possible. And there's some cool effects that you can do with this Law that you wouldn't be able to run in a constructed format. A good example is the Purple Magellan. You could end up throwing it onto the field, kind of hating on your opponent's Dawn, and then bounce it back to hand and then play it again another turn if you have a board full of 5. There's some cool effects here. If you're going to run any leader that has 4 life, I'd consider Sanji and Law to be the only ones to really seriously consider. But once again, you're going to be at a huge disadvantage if you go 4 life instead of the 5. So Law is a consider, but probably don't run, sad as it is to say. Next up, Luffy. This one is just even worse than Law in the fact that it's a 4 life, but also it's a very specific archetype of supernovas or Straw Hat Crew for the payoff for the leader. There's a fair amount of them. There's like, I think 14 or so supernovas or Straw Hat rather in the OP-02 set, but once again, are you pulling them? You don't know. So I wouldn't consider running this. Next up is Odin. With Odin, it's very similar to how Kinemon was, how I described Kinemon. If you don't have Land of Wano cards in your packs, it's kind of a bust. So I would consider, and also I think Odin personally is like a worse Kinemon. That's up for argument, but if you're going to run a Land of Wano leader, just run Kinemon instead. Doflamingo is an absolute bust in this set. I would not consider running Doflamingo. You're looking for 7 Warlords of the Sea, and I think there's only like 5 or 6 7 Warlord cards. And I think half of those are, or maybe 2 or 3 of those are above the cost of 4. So it's just like, there's no point. Just don't run this leader. It's not worth it. Blue Purple Kaido is the same as the rest of the 4 lifers. I would not consider running this leader. You're at a disadvantage. The effect it's just underwhelming for what you're getting, especially 4 life. I would pass on Kaido. Same thing with Blue Purple Croc. You could end up getting a lot of events, and if you do, that's awesome, but 4 life is 4 life. I'm telling you guys, 4 life is you're at a huge disadvantage when you're at 4 life. Consider the 5 lifers and only 2 4 lives in my opinion. Of course, I could be wrong here, but that's just how I feel. I would pass on this Crocodile as well. King, I think, finally gets like a place in some play. I'm going to try out King one of the days that I'm doing a pre-release. There's not a lot of cards in OP-02 that really mess with your Dawn. And the thing is, King has always been one of those cards where people say, oh, he doesn't really play like a purple leader. Purple is always wanting to subtract Dawn from their field to get like an effect. But if you're having access to all kinds of cards, you don't have to play purple and you can play other colors, right? And so the effect of having 10 Dawn cards on your side of the field and keeping those 10 is very, very likely. There's like 3 or 4 cards in OP-02 that your opponent could play that would mess up your Dawn. And those are all in purple. I think there's like purple event cards only with triggers, and then also the SR Magellan. But the chances of your opponent actually pulling those is pretty low. So I would say King is a really good leader in this set, and then also for this format, and the ability to minus all your opponent's characters by 1,000 power on your turn, super strong. So I'd actually put King up there with the card that I would consider to play. Now, I don't know if we're going to have access to the black starter deck by the time pre-release rolls out, but if we do, then Sakazuki is one that I just wouldn't consider running anyway. So if you have access to it, it doesn't really matter. I wouldn't recommend running this leader. It is, I don't know. I think it's one of those where it's like the same thing as Smoker, same thing as Z. If you don't have cards that have minus cost abilities for your opponent's characters, there's no point running it. So skip on this one. Shanks is one that actually could be pretty good depending on what your pull looks like. So if you are if you're able to pull out enough film type characters, I think there's 14 in total across green and purple. This effect is really strong, giving all of your film type characters plus 2,000 power during the turn. That is really, really good, especially for a 5 life leader. However, it's once again very niche in the sense that you have to get the film type characters for this effect to really take place or to have a really strong showing. So this one's a consider if you start seeing a lot of film cards. If you don't see enough film cards for this to really do well, I would skip it. With Kaido is a strong leader no matter what. The effect is very evergreen. It doesn't matter what you're playing. You can use this whenever you'd like. You don't have to have a situation for this to happen like some other leaders. And I think the ability to trash one of your opponent's life cards is it's strong. It's just a strong effect. You're probably going to want to use this once during the entire time that you're playing in a match. But regardless, you don't have to have anything for this. Like, there's no prerequisites. It's just a strong evergreen effect. So in my opinion, I think Kaido's a pretty strong leader for this. Crocodile is also one that I think is pretty good for this format. It's, once again, a like an evergreen effect. You don't have to have something specific on your side of the field. There's going to be quite a lot of cards that your opponent is playing that is 5 or less costs, and you might want to return some of them. And minusing 4 Dawn is totally worth it. I think Crocodile is one that's going to surprise some people because you don't see it, you didn't really see it in OP-01 as far as like a strong constructed leader. But in a pre-release format like this, I think it actually ends up shining a bit. So I would consider running Crocodile. Of course, Kid was great in constructed. Kid is great in pre-release. The leader ability is just absolutely just bonkers. Like, being able to swing twice can win you games, absolutely. So you're going to also have some dead cards in hand from time to time, and being able to pitch them to use your leader ability is great. So Kid is one of those, along with like Zoro. I'd say Crocodile, ones that you'd want to play, that the effect is just strong. It's just a strong effect. On a personal note, I've played green since the super pre-release. Like, I played the Kid starter deck super pre-release. I played it in deck limited battles. I played it for all of OP-01. I'm like wanting to change it up a little bit, but at the same time, I just know how strong Kid is, so maybe I'll just succumb to my weakness and play it anyway. Just like all the other starter deck leaders from OP-01, Luffy is one that you should definitely consider running for this pre-release event. Giving your characters Rested Dawn, it's basically just very efficient no matter what. I'd say that this is one that I'm leaning towards playing just because it's Luffy. You know, you have the plot armor, you can't lose with him, right? But on top of that, just like, it's a strong leader effect. There's no prerequisite for this one either. So Luffy is one that I would definitely consider. If I'm running a list of like top 5 leaders, I'd probably say that Luffy, Kid, Crocodile, Zoro, and even King are probably in that top 5 of leaders to play. Uta, the one that basically gives up to one of your characters with no base effect, 2,000 power during the turn. I think you can still play this. I think it's okay. I think there's better cards out there. Like, I think Luffy's just a better leader. I think Zoro's a better leader. But if you want to play this, I don't see why not. It's not a horrible card. You're going to have enough vanilla cards for this to really take place. So now that we've gone over the leaders, there's a lot of cards in this set that you're going to probably come across and you're going to say, should I add this to my deck? Should I not? Is this card worth it? Is it good? And the best way to evaluate, I'm not going to go over all of the cards because that might take some time, and obviously my opinions are going to be different than everybody else's, but I can give you some general advice on how to approach a sealed event. The way that Magic players approach a sealed event is there's something called BREAD. There's an acronym for a priority list, which is called BREAD, which stands for you want to prioritize bombs, removal, evasion, aggro, and then duds, right? So what that means is you're going to want to find cards that are really strong. That's your bombs. You're going to find cards that can take care of your opponent's threats, which is removal. Evasion, which doesn't really apply to the One Piece card game. Aggro, which kind of applies, but I would say aggro might be something a little too more specific for Magic. And then duds is just basically everything else. So the way that I would approach the One Piece card game is very similar to the bread theory, but instead of bread, let's go with grape. And what grape could stand for is for G, your game winners. Those are your bombs. They're going to be cards like the 9 cost Edward Newgate, the 10 cost Kuzan. Those cards are strong and are going to win you the game. So the R stands for removal, which would be anything that takes care of your opponent's threats. For instance, you could do something like Vista in red, or I think Venison Shoot in green, just for some examples, just things that take care of the character cards on your opponent's side of the field. Next up for A would be advantage. So any kind of card that will give you an advantage, I think, is very important, especially in sealed formats. Being able to draw cards like hand advantage is, I think, something that a lot of people overlook. It's very, very important to be able to draw into cards in such a small, limited format. There's not a lot of synergies in sealed, and so being able to draw through your deck as best you can is, I think, very strong. So you might want to consider cards, which also Ivankov SR is a bomb I would consider, but this thing allows you to draw cards if you have a small amount of hand. So things like that are really important. So I would prioritize hand advantage. Next up for P would be any kind of 2K counters, event cards, or any kind of blockers. I think you can consider the hand advantage and protection to be very similar in priority level. However, you're going to see less cards that will give you like hand advantage. So that's why I put that slightly above cards that give you protection. So anything that gives you protection is very highly valued in this set as well. So make sure to add blockers, 2K counters, events into your deck where it makes sense. And then finally, just everything else, just evaluate what synergies your deck has. Look at stat lines across the board, what looks strong from what's remaining after you've taken care of the grape acronym. And yeah, I think if you take that into effect, consider what's out there. Like I said, there's a lot of cards. I'm not going to go over all of them, but consider what's out there and see what you draw and what serves your deck well. Anyways, that's my take on the pre-release tournament and how to approach sealed in general. I hope you guys are able to take something away from this, whether it's, you know, what leader you're going to play or maybe a strategy on how to approach building your deck. If you have any questions or comments or ideas on how to approach this better, please let me know in the comments. While you're also at it, make sure to subscribe and like the video. And there'll be more content to come, whether it's like card openings or more long form content like this. But regardless, hope to see you guys around for more as we approach OP-02. I'm super excited and I hope you guys are as well. Anyways, take care and I'll see you next time.